Hello and thanks for joining Thinking Space, which is a new and frankly different way of doing things. So in these workshops, we take a problem and attempt to tease out solutions based on common ground from different perspectives. Thinking Space is about finding real and achievable solutions based around intelligent debate, open-mindedness and, dare I say it, common sense. Ironically, as we navigate through these rather unprecedented and rather depressing times, there's never been a more important or appropriate time to launch with today's Thinking Space debate, which is the future of the high street. Rarely a day passes without sort of depressing media news of images of boarded up shops, threats of bankruptcy, job losses, etc. So while the high street has faced a series of challenges over the decade, coronavirus has simply added quite seriously in most cases to these woes and highlights the need for radical thinking going forward. So today I'm delighted to say we have four bright, insightful minds who kindly have given up their time from lockdown to chew the fat and hopefully come up with some innovative and thought-provoking suggestions. We've got Dan Sims, co-head of retail at international commercial real estate firm Colliers International. Will Godfrey, Chief Executive of Bath and North East Somerset Council, who's been involved in urban regeneration projects across the UK. Emilio Pimentel-Reid, editor, brand consultant and author with a number of consulting roles with retailers and manufacturers. And Oliver Tress, Chief Executive of UK-wide high street fashion and accessory retailer Oliver Bonus. Guys, welcome and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So let's start by sort of establishing some facts. You know, if we look at splitting the problem possibly into three parts: one, establishing the facts; secondly, what needs to be done and what we're currently doing; and three, what possible changes could be implemented to create some sort of fresh thinking and reinvigorate the high street. So if we start with these basic facts, many people point to the internet as a major cause of the high street's demise. Yet actually only 20% of retail comes from online. It still leaves 80% with the high street. Another bone of contention we often hear seems to be around rates. Yet I'm told only £7 billion is generated from retail rates. Yet 400 billion is generated in revenue. So it's around 2%. And lastly, footfall is said to have gone down, but actually it's only around 2% per annum. So on the face of this, not sort of hugely significant. So Oliver, let me start with you. If I may, you're on the front line. So notwithstanding coronavirus and all the immediate challenges, which has simply exacerbated the problem, what is the wider issue from a sort of retailer's perspective?
Well, one thing I should say as a retailer is that every retail is actually slightly different in a nuanced way. The way we interact with our customers, the customer base, and the nature of the product, and whether it sells online or not, and whether you're competing with the likes of Amazon. And in our case, we've worked really hard to create a niche that we think is different and makes it worthwhile customers coming to find us. And obviously, we're a business started 26 years ago. So when we started, the internet wasn't an option. And so we built this legacy business, what might be regarded as a legacy business of the store portfolio. And alongside it, obviously, in the last 15, 20 years, we've built an online business, which now represents until recently, represented about 20% of our turnover. And I think having gone through a year or two in the last sort of post-Brexit period anyway, of pretty uncertain times, we actually felt just prior to COVID arriving, relatively happy with our mix of stores and online. We might have pushed more towards online if we could, but actually the way the market was going, the online retailers were finding it very hard to attract and keep new customers, very expensive, put it that way. And it was beginning to creep into the business models that actually these online pure play needed physical stores. So online's been with us quite a long time now and is going through its own sort of story. But we broadly still believe in a multi-channel, I suppose, approach. For us, it's more about balancing the size of the stores themselves, the size of the portfolio, coverage of the country, that in our case, just the UK. And so in a sense, we've got an opportunity. If we were to go overseas, how would we approach it if we had a blank sheet of paper as a good test for how happy we are, in a sense, with our existing model. But broadly, we've got stores, we're happy with stores. There's lots you could say about it, and Dan, who is actually our property agent, can go into some of the detail. But so long as the costs of stores are still fall within a sensible sort of profit and loss, then we're still happy to open stores.
So Dan, I mean, it's interesting because Ollie, your business is a fairly niche business. It's a reasonably successful business by all accounts, but there are a lot of more sort of traditional retailers that aren't doing so well. So Dan, that must pose quite an issue for you. Some of the the more sort of traditional legacy retailers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're in a time of enormous structural change. Even before the current crisis, we were in a huge structural change in retail property, and I work on that interface between the retail property market that in turn supports the retailers in doing their business. And there's a huge change there, much of it driven by the 20% that's been lost online. Whilst you could say there's still 80% of spend goes through stores, losing 20% over a 15-year period is an absolutely enormous change. And what it's done is it's been one of the key drivers to expose the difficulty of the retail model in terms of its costs and its margin. And as money has drifted away online, and at the same time online is a very transparent pricing model, which has actually capped a lot of retailers' ability to price themselves out of problems by increasing prices of their products. So it's created, in effect, a huge oversupply of retail. As you remove 20p in the pound from spending, you basically don't need a large swathe of the property that's out there. That's a very easy statement to make, but we all know property is a very expensive, cumbersome physical entity, and removing it from one supply chain and turning it into something else and something meaningful is a very, very convoluted, difficult and long process. And that's the process that we're all involved in at the moment, trying to rebalance the amount of space that's out there with the right people who are in it.
And presumably rates fall into this category quite, they're an important component part of this. So Will, from a government perspective, what can local and national government do in terms of showing flexibility to help sort of reinvigorate the high street?
Yeah, so it's an interesting debate, isn't it? Because certainly before the 1990s, business rates were set and controlled by local authorities, and then it went into a central control. And from a local authority point of view, we have very, very limited ability to mitigate the cost to retailers about business rates. So a lot of people still assume that local authorities have got a massive control over business rates, and that's simply not the case. I understand that from an operational perspective, business rates are, probably a significant part of people's cost, and they're part of cost that sort of, goes up, and people don't seem to have much control over them. From a local authority perspective, what I would argue is we need to have a first principles review of the concept of business rates, because it's absolutely the case that over the last 10, 15 years, as people's property portfolios have changed to take on board people different habits, business rates haven't changed in the same way. So the fundamental principle of business rates probably does need to be reviewed.
There's effectively a disconnect here between reality and what needs to happen.
Yeah. Now the difficulty from a central government point of view is that business rates are now absolutely baked into the funding of local authorities. So it's one of those issues that I think everybody knows we've got to solve, but actually solving it now in the middle of a crisis where actually just the funding base of local authorities is under threat, we need to think quite imaginatively and creatively about how we find the space to have that conversation, rather than doing something that is going to bake in another problem for the next 20 years. So, my view is we've got to go back to first principles and really think this will not be constrained by the model we've got before us today.
And how do we do that?
We do that by having these sort of conversations that are really about, you know, casting aside our individual agendas, I suppose, and just trying to have a genuine conversation about how can you create a economy, and how can you renew an economy in a way that actually understands the problems we've got. I just feel as though what we've done the last 20 years is we put sticking plaster over sticking plaster over sticking plaster. And actually what it's shown is that when you get to a shock to the system like we've got at the moment, it can't cope. So actually, if we just go back and put a sticking plaster on, I think we might be in the same position in 5 or 10 years' time. We do need to think about first principles.
Is there a case for a bit of repurposing here of commercial to residential where needed? Is there a case where perhaps you say, well, in a particular area, not all high streets are the same, and in a particular area there might be a greater need for more residential and less commercial, and the rules are probably tight set in stone? Is there a possibility that they could be changed?
Yeah, so, you know, I've had experience of working as a chief executive in small places. I've worked in Bristol, I've worked in Newport, I'm now working in Bath. So, you know, I've got an understanding. I've had some exposure to small places, bigger places, medium-sized places, whatever. But the framework is very constricting. So I guess the narrative for the last 6 months has been people have been moving away from retail development and actually thinking, well, the future was an office development. Well, actually, the truth now is the future isn't an office development, because a lot of those people who are thinking about moving that way will now be going, well, actually, the future is working from home. So I agree with you. I think the high street and towns and cities generally need to be rethought, repurposed, and the planning system needs to be reviewed. We need to go back to a first principles review of how we actually do regeneration. Unless we do that, we'll probably bumble along, but I don't think we will fundamentally be able to address the structural issues that we're faced with now.
Well, let me step in, because I think that we've heard a lot of interesting points about central government and local government and business rates, but we haven't really discussed the consumer who is actually wanting to shop. And I think that it's important to step back and think about how do we make these shops interesting for people to actually want to go in them. And if we need to keep these estates occupied so we don't have barren high streets, what sort of experiences do the shops need to be? Because with that, you know, the consumer has a choice, and maybe they just find, you know, Amazon really useful for a lot of their shopping, and therefore a big chunk of the shops on the high street are currently irrelevant because they don't offer the ease and convenience of just being able to shop on your phone. So a big part of, and I go back to what Ollie said at the beginning, niche, a big part of bringing the high street back beyond the conversations of what the central government is going to do or not and all that, is actually what sort of shops do we need, and what sort of shops are actually encouraging people to leave their houses. There's a store that is emerging in the US, and it's called CAMP, C-A-M-P, and they offer experiences, and their ethos is seamless blend of play and product. So you go there, there's experiences, you can shop, there's food, there's all sorts of things. And so that you can't really do at home, and you can't do that on Amazon. And so, you know, even if shops get favorable business rates and all that, if their model is boring and their product mix is wrong, no one's going to shop.
So I agree with that.
So we should think of the consumer.
I don't think it's just about the consumer. I think it's about reimagining town centres and city centres generally, and that's about making the environment more friendly. So it's about pedestrianising city centres. It's about making them places where people want to go, where people want to live. So the consumer's part of that, but the consumer's not the only part of that.
But I mean, making it attractive to whom? So I think that if a town is going to create a destination, they have to know who they're targeting, who are their shoppers, how much do they make, you know, what do they want to be buying? Because you know, you do find sometimes a disconnect between, I mean, do the consumers in that town actually want to walk around, or do they want the convenience of being able to park somewhere? I mean, I think the bigger picture is there needs to be a plan as to where a specific retail destination is going, and then everything follows from that.
I think that's right, and that I think one of the key questions that about consumers is, and the key challenges is, how can you create somewhere that a consumer will prefer to visit rather than sitting on their sofa pressing the buttons on their tablet? Because that is our challenge today, and it's a very different challenge to the challenge we had 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And you have to overcome that inertia of someone just sitting pressing buttons at home. And I think that goes right all the way, the journey all the way through. It has to go through to, is your town centre accessible? Is the car parking easy? Is the car parking free? And then is the mix of shops there compelling and interesting? And are you going to get a you know, sales service that is leagues above just buying something online? All those parts, you're absolutely right, they're all part of it, and the mix of tenants in that town centre is absolutely all part of it. And I think town centres definitely need to be more than they've become in the last few years. They became, you know, the classic clone town was just shops. It was a boring mix of retail and was just shops. Whereas if you wound back a few generations from that, it was shops and a hotel and a library and offices and maybe a college on top of it, etc., all mixed in together. So there was a great diversity of uses, and we inadvertently stripped away most of those other uses in this pursuit of retail in high streets, and it's backfired on us. And I think the consumer wants a bigger mix of things there now, and I think that's, you know, that's absolutely what we're going to need to go back to in many high streets to make them interesting for people to get off their sofas.
Well, that was certainly a neat summary, Dan. Thanks. So I guess the next point is, what can we do to make the high street attractive enough to persuade people to get up off their sofas and visit? That's the nub of it, isn't it? So if we move on to thinking now about possible solutions, or at least identifying what it is that is blocking these sort of solutions. So in summary, so far, we've talked about physical shops, which still represent 80% of retail, so clearly an important part of the retail scene, but they're under significant pressure, both because of losses of market share to online and pressure on margins. We've also got, secondly, I suppose, we all agree that there's a need for fresh thinking, both by retailers and planners. Thirdly, as Will and Dan have pointed out, there are current ways in which we plan and finance the high street, rates and so on, and these appear to be just, you know, out of date. So with all this in mind, we move really to section 2, which is all about new thinking and innovation. So I think, Emilio, let me start with you. What should this look like?
I was very encouraged by Ollie mentioning that he is in a niche business, because I think that the word niche is very important. If we're going to shop at your store or your website, you need to be different and exciting. And then following on from what Dan said about there now being a movement to 20% online, this is 20% of our time that we are not spending in a physical shop because it's just convenient and the shops aren't attracting us to their retail spaces. And then going on to the local authorities, I completely understand that the current model encourages local authorities to now be the landlords of our retail shops. But, you know, with all respect to the local authorities, you know, retail does demand innovation, excitement, and it's questionable whether our civil servants are the best people to deliver an exciting shopping experience. So I completely agree with Will that we need some sort of refocusing, restructuring, reinvention of how our retail works. And I think that the shops that are successful now give us a reason to go visit them, to leave our homes.
This sounds like a partnership is required then between innovative retailers, forget the ones that have been around for years that are on the way out, but new innovative retailers and local government.
Definitely innovative retailers and landlords. And in those cities where there is a local government component, then I think that the local government needs to stop thinking like local government and start thinking like creative people, like they're entertainers. The mindset needs to shift in order for them to make a success of where we're going.
Of course, Will, you've worked on sort of new urban regeneration projects. How practical is the sort of the model that Emilio is suggesting?
I think it is practical if we have a different framework. So I take Bath as an example. We've got, we own a huge amount of commercial property within the city. Now, you might say that's the right thing or the wrong thing to do, but that's the reality of the position that we're in. Unfortunately, we're then constrained by the fact that we have to balance our financial position over every 12-month period. So if we could create a partnership with a developer, something, and we would talk to the guys on this panel, that would be great. But I would still be constrained by the fact that within my organisation, I'd have to balance my budget on a 12-month basis. If I could go to government and say, look, on the next 3 to 5 years, I've got all these assets sitting on my balance sheet, so you know that I'm a solvent organisation. Can you give me the flexibility to create a partnership with these guys to actually bring higher value into the city? But that might take me 2, 3, 4 years. Give me that time to do that, as opposed to constraining. So at the moment, the problem is we've got a framework which is individual levers rather than one system, and that then creates the type of mindset that Emilio's talking about. I think I've met lots of people who work in local government who want to be more creative, who want to be more innovative, but actually our current framework is a bit of a constraint. And I think there's something for me about people understanding that framework can be constraining, and the more that we can get people helping us to push that message for government and actually creating a different framework, the better we'll be collectively as a country to actually build a higher value economy.
So it sounds like the object is we need to bash heads together here, and Will needs to work with Dan, with Emilio, with all of you to actually to build a model that potentially could be taken to government to try and change that framework. Because it sounds as though the framework here is the blocker. That's the problem.
Yeah, and certainly from my perspective, I would absolutely welcome a conversation. Nothing frustrates me more than being constrained by the rules that I currently have to work within. If we could change our framework, I know that we could work much more effectively. At the moment, there's like an inbuilt frustration from everybody that people think that local government isn't creative, and I'm not sure I agree with that. And we sometimes think that people in the private sector have got unrealistic expectations about actually what we can do. And I think that's a product of the framework we're in, rather than our minds and our ability to create different solutions.
Ollie, I want to come to you because you've got a successful niche business. Where do you sit in terms of your relationship with government, either local or national? What needs to
happen? Sorry, I was still thinking about what Will was just saying, and Dan didn't say anything, but I'm quite interested to get Dan's perspective on it, because we've been involved in some council-led developments. And rather than comment too much myself, I think Dan's perspective would be more useful.
Let's go to Dan then. Sorry,
do you want to do
right,
that?
actually. Dan will
that's
be more
all right.
So I'll ask the same question. So, Dan, you've heard what Will said. I mean, how practical is it in terms of being able to work with local government, obviously representing not just retailers, but in your case, representing the landlords?
Yeah, it varies enormously, as Will says, and some are much more responsive than others. And the perspective that I always try to take it back to, and I think it ties in very much with Will's comment that we need a bit of a reset here overall, is that I think everybody should come from the perspective that the retail industry and the property industry that supports it is a gigantic and very important ecosystem. It's not little elements that support in different directions. It's a huge socio-economic ecosystem. It employs 3 million people. That's 10% of our workforce, 400 billion pounds worth of sales, and it's 5% of our GDP. And I often hear these very narrow discussions around business rates on the one hand, or local authority ownership, or private ownership, etc., etc. And they're too narrow, these discussions, and the discussion just about business rates alone is too narrow, because when you're looking at whether a shop can sustain its own business rates, you should also be thinking about how many people does that shop employ, how much income tax do they pay, how much corporation tax does that retailer pay, how much VAT goes through that store. And I think there needs to be a much wider appreciation and perspective on what this whole system does for us as a society, as an economy. And when we get into these, and when the typical narrow discussions that you hear in the press all the time happen, it doesn't take us anywhere, because it just looks at a very small sliver of the problem. So I think if we could take the discussion back to really understanding what this whole ecosystem means for all of us, I think we'd have more value. We'd understand the value of it. We'd take care of it more, and we'd spend more time on it.
Dan, can I ask, what we're talking about, councils and local authorities, what do they sort of represent in terms of retail ownership? I don't imagine it's that significant, is it, in the big scheme of things?
It depends where you are. If you're in Will's instance, in Bath, I think for historic reasons, actually,
yeah.
that in Bath, the city council own a very substantial amount of the high street stock. Elsewhere, it had been declining until the last few years, and in many towns you'd have very small local authority ownerships, but that reversed quite a lot in the last 6 or 7 years as local authorities started investing back in their own town centres and also investing elsewhere, using the public loan board funds. And they were doing that partly to give themselves, on the one hand, give themselves some income to fill in some of the gaps in their budgets, but also to give themselves a stake back in their town centres. So in certain instances, and you've been exposed to a few of them on some of the deals that you've done over the last few years, the local authority is now sort of back again and very key to the town centre. So we've sort of gone back to the future a bit on that.
In terms of planning, what are the specifics that need to be addressed?
The traditional planning system is very restrictive all round, and it dictates what uses you can use in different parts of town centres, and in turn they're dictated by large plans that are only reviewed and renewed every few years. And given how quickly the retail industry has moved in the last few years, they very quickly become out of date. The moment they're done, they're already out of date. And so the needs of retail occupiers and the needs of other occupiers in town centre often moves very fast and way ahead of the local authority plans. So I think there is definitely an argument now that a much greater degree of flexibility needs to be built into all of these plans to accommodate how things are changing.
Ollie, do you think that this could have affected your ability to expand further had the framework been more user-friendly in a way?
I don't know that planning has been, I wouldn't say planning's been a big issue itself for me. I know other retailers, I've heard Next talk about it a lot, and I'm to presume that's to do with out-of-town developments. But no, planning is not a particular issue for us as a general rule.
Well, that's actually really interesting, Ollie, and possibly not what people expected to hear, but this sort of brings it back to local authorities. So, Will, I suppose many people will be surprised at just how much property local authorities own, in terms of commercial property, that is. Is this a help or a hindrance in terms of innovation and in terms of helping to refresh the high street?
So I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with the local authority holding property as an investment. I think it's all to do with the mindset. So the reason you do that, and actually, if I always think that the reason that I want to be holding those sort of things is to have a stake in the development of your place, right? So if we are making decisions and we've got a stake in what's happening, we've got a stake in that outcome, and actually politicians therefore engage in those conversations in a very different way than if they just feel as though people are coming into their town or city and are just essentially trying to make a quick buck. So I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong. My sense is, though, that certainly what we've done over the last 20, 30 years is planning's often been used as a basis for talking about large infrastructure projects, whereas I actually believe that this recovery is more like a renewal than a recovery, and is going to be based much more locally than just government saying, well, we'll agree the next 10 massive infrastructure projects. And that's part of the problem. We're a very centrally controlled country. So, UK government will send out guidance for X, Y, Z, and then we have to decide what we're going to do with that guidance. Whereas actually, I think, what we need to try to encourage government to do is to trust much more in local places, trust them to be different, trust us to work together, and trust us to come up with solutions that are actually going to be for the benefit of local communities and the local economy. Now, I believe we've got all the people who can do that, but you need to give us the flexibility to create sometimes our own local frameworks to deliver the outcomes, because places are very different. I've worked from places in Petersfield in Hampshire that was small, needed different very things, to a big city in Bristol. The fact you've got to work within the same framework is actually quite constraining, because the outcomes that were needed in those two places were very different.
And of course, that's a very important point. Diversity. Not all high streets are the same. They are very different. Different markets need different things. So, and that is highlighted as you've just pointed out.
Local authorities have grown so big. Local authorities have also grown so big that they are overseeing many high streets, not just the high street of one specific city or town. And sometimes you see, like in London, when Mount Street was created as a destination, or even Elizabeth Street, it seemed like the estates were able to select the sort of environment that they wanted to create, this sort of editing and strategy that you sometimes see missing on local high streets. You go to certain high streets and it's just coffee shops or burger places or pizza, and you have like 6 pizza places. So I think that whoever it is that is in charge of the real estate at this moment needs to decide what sort of a destination your area wants, should be in the long run, and take an active role in delivering that.
Yes,
otherwise it's not in your hands.
No, and that's why I was interested in the actual percentage of property owned by councils, because they are in that role. They do have that possibility of being the landlord of a large chunk and controlling it, curating it, creating an environment that people want to visit. Because a lot of high streets aren't like that. And as you said, each individual landlord says, who's going to pay me the most bucks and how long do I think they'll be able to survive for? They'll do some calculation along those lines, but it's nothing to do with any kind of curation, which ultimately is what drives people to a high street. So councils are in an unusual position in that regard. And you've given some examples of Mount Street and Elizabeth Street and famously Marylebone High Street.
Yes, that's right.
Have been very successful. But arguably, I suppose shopping centres are in that category as well. They've created their own high street, and some work better than others, and some now have failed altogether, which brings us back to structural change. But whether this problem of the 12-month balancing of the books is a constraining factor, Dan, was that a constraining factor in Wokingham, where we did a deal, or I know that in Canterbury City Centre, the councillor have taken on a lot of property there. Do they have the same issues?
Yes, and I think there's a really important point that's come out of a lot of this is this obligation on some local authorities to think short term. And actually, if you're going to curate an environment, you've got to think exactly the other way around. The only way in which you can curate something properly and meaningfully is to take your time over it. And there's no secret that those big landed estates in central London that have been mentioned so far are owned by very long-termistic owners who don't have huge big debt provisions that they need the quickest income to repay. So there's a very different dynamic in those instances, which allows them to take a very long-term view at curating the right environment. And as Will has said, if a local authority is obliged to think short-term, they're going to really struggle to curate. So actually, if you're going to, the best way to help people to think longer term is to take some of those very short-term pressures off them. And Woking was an interesting example in that the perspective we had from that local authority is that they were thinking long-term in that instance, and that the number one issue for them was to get the right retailers in place, not get the best deals in place. And that came through quite clearly in that instance, and they must have been thinking on a much longer-term basis, because that would not have been a short-term solution otherwise.
I have a question maybe for Will and Dan, who may know more. I don't know what direction rents are going in right now, or what sort of special deals are being negotiated with the individual retailers. But I imagine that maybe people are getting better deals than they would have in the past. Is that the case?
Yeah, very much so. And even before we hit the current crisis, the average rent in the UK was 30% lower than 2008. So we'd had a very steady drift down of rents on average. And in real terms, rents just before the crisis were half what they were in 2008. So actually, it's probably the worst investment anywhere in the world is to invest in retail property in the UK, because the rental story is absolutely terrible. And that story will be even worse post this crisis. That will take another very meaningful jolt downwards.
Sorry to interrupt, but then if we are going to be offering a retailer a really good deal, a deal that would not have been offered in the past, should we make sure that we're offering this deal to the best possible retailer for the long term, rather than just offering a good deal to, one that maybe doesn't fit a long-term plan?
So let me just give you an example, right? So these are just some numbers for you. Our budget is about 120 million pounds.
Yes.
50. We depend on 16 million pounds worth of income from our commercial estate to essentially balance our budget and be able for us to provide lots of other services. Now, we've probably got 60-70% of our tenants at the moment saying to us they want to renegotiate their rents off our commercial estate. Now, the reality for me is that actually we need to rebalance our whole asset base. So we need to come out of retail space and we need to think about different types of investment. And we need to restructure the finances of our business. Mm-hmm. Doing that over a 10-12 month period will actually mean us taking some perverse decisions just to balance a budget, as opposed to thinking about the long-term situation about our city centre. If we were able to say to government, okay, well, actually, it's going to take us 2 or 3 years for us to rebalance our asset base. Let us balance our budgets over 3 years, which means we can then work with developers and our partners across the city. We'll still balance the budget over 3 years, but we'll be able to do that in a much more considered way, right? Now, at the moment, we can't actually do that because essentially we're not allowed to set deficit budgets. Okay, but if an element of that framework was relaxed, we'd be able to have a much more strategic conversation that will enable us to think differently about how we manage our assets, the type of assets that we're in. Now, we are probably an extreme in the sense that we've got much more commercial property that supports our budget than most other authorities will have. So Wokingham may very well have a situation where they were able to do that because actually that money wasn't supporting their ongoing budget. We would find that difficult to do in the short term, but our mindset is we'd like to do that, but the framework constrains us from having that type of conversation.
So who do you have that conversation with? I mean, how does this change?
Yes.
Well, so what we need, as I said at the beginning, we need a first principles conversation that says, if in the UK we need to reimagine our high streets, and that will be built off a partnership between the public sector and the private sector, we need conversations with government that says that, it's not just the private sector going in and complaining about councils and then councils going in and complaining about the pressure they're put under, as it were. It's actually collectively we need to go to government and say, do you know what? We know we can solve this problem. What we need you to do is to help us by relaxing some of these rules, even for a short period of time, to enable us to test out some of these solutions. Now, that shouldn't be beyond, the wit of the human race to do that. We just need to be braver and bolder to say to government, actually, these are the tools we need, and we need government to trust us. And when I mean us collectively to actually find the solutions much more locally. Because if you go to the continent, you can see that's what they do, and they do it much more effectively than we do.
Okay, so the question is, everything needs to change, and what could government do in terms of helping to enable this change that everybody wants?
Well, in my view, what they could do is, number one, open their doors to listen to people like us who actually have got some real hand experience of how to do these things, and then to genuinely test out, even if it's only on a pilot basis, to test out whether or not those models can be made to work. So I'm not advocating you move from a totally constrained model to something that's a complete free-for-all. But what I am saying is that in these current circumstances, to renew our economy, we are going to have to think differently.
Dan, from your perspective, how realistic is this? I mean, we're at almost crossroads now where, the high street had issues even before COVID-19. Yeah. What COVID-19 has done is it's brought the problem to a head. And in a way, it's quite a good time because obviously it's an opportunity to start with a blank canvas and think with, completely new and fresh ideas. But from your perspective as a property expert and one that represents a number of landlords, how do you see this physically working?
I think on the one hand, I think we're going to all of these changes and the rebasing of value and the rebasing of income that's driven from these things, and also the move towards people trying to think longer term. And I think that's an interesting theme that's come out quite consistently here is longer term thinking that unlocks some of the things we need to do. And I think what that's going to fundamentally mean is the types of people and organisations that own retail property in the UK is going to have to change. I can see a place for local authority ownership and the meaningful reasons why they would do that, but debt-driven or absolutely income-focused ownership of retail property doesn't feel like it's going to work very well, certainly for the next few years. If you are an institutional owner that uses it to pay out income, but you're not holding debt and you don't have those pressures, you might have a little more freedom to think longer term. But if you're a heavily debt-driven REIT that is obliged to pay out income and your share price is absolutely linked to your income, it doesn't feel like a lot of retail property is where you need to be anymore. It doesn't feel like the right fit. So I think this is going to have very significantly push a change in direction as to actually who owns retail property. But also I think it's going to be another change in the last few years. We've seen lots of changes in how landlords and tenants interact and arrange their lease agreements. The old lease agreement used to be very long term and it was just a straight rent. It was a very cold relationship that started and finished on the discussion around those points. And we've seen the market moving much more towards a balanced, aligned interest between the two of them, most of which now is driven around rents being based on turnovers and on store performance. That's been going on for a few years, but I think this crisis is going to very, very significantly accelerate the move to turnover-linked relationships between landlord and tenant. And actually what that will also fundamentally underpin is this alignment between landlord and tenant and that longer-term thinking between them. So actually it could ultimately all point in the right direction.
And of course, you've got a super tenant here in Ollie, one of your real tenants. I mean, Ollie, what you hear, is this heartening? Is this something you think could actually be a bit of a game changer?
Well, yes, and as Dan alluded to, the relationship's changed. We've done a lot of deals on a turnover basis, and that gives us a lot of protection from the downside of getting a store wrong or underperforming and having a heavy fixed cost just relentlessly coming at you. And a landlord has to have faith in us as a company, as a brand, that we'll deliver, and for the most part, we'll deliver sales, but also to some extent deliver some footfall to their location. If it's a shopping centre or they own the whole high street. Yes, for us, I think that's what I was referring to at the beginning, saying that actually we still believe in stores, but the numbers still have to add up. And our store sales actually, until COVID hit, were just fractionally up in positive territory. And so, they're not up enough really in historical classical sense, which is they need to be up by sort of 5% or something. But if costs can come down a bit each year, your property costs, then it still all makes sense. And the calculation gets more complicated because you've got the halo effect of online, you've got click and collect for customers, so it's got the sort of attribution of your value gets harder. But on balance, as I said, we still believe in the multi-channel model, having stores. It suits our business possibly more than, Amazon may never open, their stores, their product breadth is too great. It wouldn't really suit them. Whereas for us, it does suit us. So we're content. But we haven't really talked about business rates, but partly because it's so dull, I expect. But it really is a potential, spanner in the works for all the good work that people might do in other areas.
But business rates are actually a relatively small part of turnover, aren't they? About 2%. So in a way, if you've got a successful model, surely business rates shouldn't be the driver of this. They are, if you're doing well, then, is it really that much of a major issue?
Well, I'll answer briefly, but I'll let Dan, because I know he's itching to come in. I think it is a problem. I was talking to a junior government minister about this question, and he said, but it's the market will just sort the high street out. We don't need to do anything. And in my opinion, the business rates is actually anti-free market. It's an artificial. It's simple but quite complicated in the effect it has. And Dan, I'll leave Dan to do the technical stuff. But no, I do actually think it's a bit of a problem. It might sound like a small percentage of 2%, but if your profits as a retail business if margins have been reduced and you're actually only making 5% profit, then 2% is 40% of your profit. And in our case, business rates is actually a lot more than 40% of our profit. So, it's really substantial. So I don't know where your figure came from, and it'll vary. You see, you have businesses with high turnover, low margin.
Yeah, I was basing it on turnover rather than adjusted net profit.
Yeah.
So, but that's an interesting debate. Maybe that is something to... Even
taking your assumption as it is, at 2%, a lot of retailers aren't making any money, which is another whole story, which is they're being propped up by people who don't want to lose their investment, but it's not a viable business. That's another separate issue, structural issue. But no, I think I'll leave it there and let Dan comment on business rates. But I would certainly be on the side of saying it's not working. It's a real obstacle, and they just need to create a solution. but I have heard that the Treasury, frankly, just kind of give up and say, it's just, we need the money, we need the 7 billion. Sorry, we've got better things to do. So I'll let Dan carry on from there.
Yeah, the government minister attitude that you heard there is the type of attitude that makes us despair all the time, because they're right in a way in that if they leave it to itself, the market will resolve the situation, but the market will resolve the situation by destroying half our high streets, because the market is skewed at the moment, that you've got a giant predator in Amazon with a very beneficial tax arrangement that's sitting there on our shoulder, price deflating everybody out of existence, deliberately making no money themselves, and totally skewing our market, and being allowed to do that by the government. So, and the government will get what they wish for on that basis, in that if it's all completely unregulated and unconstrained, we will get epic destruction, I think. So that will come to pass if they do let that happen. The business rate impact is very significant. I think Ollie's outlined that very eloquently, in that retail now in the UK, sadly, is a very high intensity, low margin business. And although rates is not a big percentage of turnover, it's a very big percentage of margin. And there's one guarantee with business rates is they will go up and up and up, regardless of everything else. And the last 10 years, we've seen rents go down and business rates go up. And most costs for retailers really needed to go down. As the model comes under more and more pressure, your costs need to reduce, but business rates relentlessly go up and up and up. And a great example that came out last couple of weeks, which shows the absolute disconnect of central from local government and from real local sensibilities, is the whole situation in Altrincham, on the Altrincham market, which was taken on by an operator a couple of years ago. An old traditional market hall was taken over by a food operator who created a very, very high quality food and beverage and market, which was an enormous success. And that in turn has led to a regeneration of the rest of the town centre as more interesting local independent operators came in and traded. Very successful example, which has been followed and studied by all sorts of other examples around the UK. They've just been hit by a 600% rates increase because they're running a very good, interesting format. And the local authority have just turned around and said, well, we didn't set it. It had nothing to do with us. It was central government. And central government and the VOA, as part of central government, have said, that's our value, and that's that. And so actually that complete disconnect and lack of understanding about the impact of these things, that could mean that market hall might fail. And that market hall has been the prime generator of regeneration in that town centre. And that's where we need this wider linkage and understanding of our ecosystem. Examples like that.
Will, do you want to come in here? Because it does sound like that there clearly is a disconnect between the aspirations of you and local government, between retailers like Ollie, property company specialists like Dan, and people sitting in their ivory towers in Westminster who do sound like they're just out of touch and actually don't understand that if you end up with a high street that fails, there are wider social and economic implications that can come back and bite them later. So what can we do to try and get a list of solvable solutions based around this very intelligent conversation we've all had and get that in front of politicians in Westminster?
Yeah, look, I totally agree with the comments. I mean, my honest view is business rates need to be certainly a significant proportion of them need to be repatriated back to the locality, because then at least there's some local ownership of the decision making. You're right, at the moment, local authorities, understandably, on lots of levels, will go, well, actually, that is set centrally. Central government need business rates to fund local authorities. And what happens at the margins is central government will say to business, well, yeah, well, local authorities can give you some element of discretionary relief. Well, that's true. But after 10 years of austerity, our margins as a business to be able to actually fund stuff like that is very, very difficult when you've got the cost of adult social care going up relentlessly. It's very difficult to be to actually be able to deliver some of these things which in isolation sound very simple, but when you look at them as part of a system and part of managing a big organisation, are actually quite constraining, which is why I say my personal view is that if we just try to keep managing with this system, I think the high street is, it's very difficult to actually see a long-term sustainable future for the high street if we've got the framework we've currently got. I do think this thing about the diversity of town centres is really, really important. I think Dan's right. I think we've gone to try to create these sort of retail heavens. Actually, we're sort of reaping what we sowed in some ways, and that's why you do need to have a longer term framework to enable us to do stuff differently.
Yeah, I think you're right. We went too far one direction, and it's burning us now in many instances.
Wasn't you, was it, Dan?
It wasn't just me. And I often think of it when I walk down my local high street, Guildford High Street. The most dominant building in the centre of the high street is not a shop. It's a beautiful old coaching inn that sits directly in the middle of the high street with rooms above it. And that's where things started from, that mix of hotel space and restaurants sitting in amongst retail. And then we've managed to lose sight of that as we've gone along, and I think we're definitely going to have to work our way back to that again. And I think the loss of a lot of our department stores is going to help that, because certainly the department stores that we're working on redeveloping, many of them have got hotel space, college space, residential space and leisure space going in upstairs.
Guys, lots of food for thought there. We are unfortunately out of time, but I have to admit, as somebody who has not been an expert in the high street myself, I've learned a lot today, and I sense that there is a real opportunity actually to come up with some really interesting, innovative ideas. It's all around creating this sort of this sort of thought leadership that effectively we've done. So Will Godfrey, Dan Sims, Oliver Tress, and Emilio Pimentel-Reid, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a really interesting discussion. I have a feeling that we could probably be talking for the next 3 hours, but I think it gives us the start of something that we could possibly take forward. The whole point of Thinking Space is to create ideas, to create a talking shop, if you liked, and to allow that to then germinate into something a bit more positive. So anyway, thank you both. Thank you all of you for joining me. And if you'd like to follow us, well, obviously we're recording this and we will put it out on our website, and you're welcome to do the same. If you'd like to follow us or attempt to create, watching as we attempt to sort of create solutions to problems like these that affects us all, do watch via the sort of social media pages, and please remember to share them as well. So thanks again to all my guests and to you for watching. So from us all, stay safe and see you next time. Thank you.